A dead homeless man wearing a military uniform washed up on a Spanish beach in 1943, and the documents found in his briefcase convinced Hitler to move entire armies away from Sicily, exactly as the British had planned. By April 1943, the Allies had a massive problem. They needed to invade Europe from the south, and everyone knew it. Churchill and Roosevelt had agreed. The target was Sicily. But there was one issue that kept military planners awake at night. The Germans knew it too. Sicily was the obvious choice. Any military strategist could look at a map and figure it out. It was the closest point to North Africa, where Allied forces had just finished their campaign. The island sat right at the tip of Italy's boot. Taking Sicily meant opening the door to mainland Europe, but obvious also meant dangerous. If the Germans expected an invasion in Sicily, they would stack the island with troops, tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The beaches would become killing zones. Thousands of Allied soldiers would die before they even made it off the landing craft. The invasion could fail completely, and if it failed, the war might drag on for years. The Allied commanders needed a solution. They needed the Germans to look somewhere else, anywhere else. They needed to make Hitler believe the invasion was coming somewhere different. Greece, maybe, or Sardinia. Somewhere far enough from Sicily that German forces would move away, leaving the real target vulnerable. But how do you fool the most paranoid military machine in the world? How do you trick German intelligence, which had agents across Europe, listening posts, code breakers, and spies embedded in neutral countries? You could send fake radio messages, but the Germans might not believe them. You could leak false information through double agents, but that was risky. The Germans might suspect a trap. What the Allies needed was something the Germans would find themselves, something they would discover on their own, without any suspicion of British involvement. Something so authentic, so genuine, that not even Hitler's inner circle would doubt it. The British had an idea, a crazy idea, an idea so bizarre that it sounded like something out of a spy novel. But sometimes the most unbelievable plans are the ones that work. They would create a fake person, give him a fake identity, dress him in a military uniform, load him with fake documents that outlined a completely fake invasion plan. And then they would dump his body in the ocean off the coast of Spain, where it would wash ashore and fall into German hands. The problem was, they needed a real body to pull it off. The operation was given a code name, Operation Mincemeat. It was one of the strangest missions ever approved by the British War Cabinet. The man behind it was Lieutenant Commander Ewen Montagu, a naval intelligence officer working for a secret division known as the 20 Committee, or the Double Cross System. This group specialized in deception, operations, turning captured German spies, spreading false information, and manipulating enemy intelligence. Montagu had been thinking about using a dead body for deception for months. The idea was not entirely new. During World War I, there were cases of soldiers carrying fake documents into battle, hoping that if they were killed, the enemy would find the papers and be misled. But no one had ever tried to stage an entire fake identity and plant a corpse as part of a strategic deception. Montagu worked with another officer, Flight Lieutenant Charles Cholmondeley from MI5. Together they began developing the plan in late 1942. They studied how bodies decompose in water. They researched Spanish politics to figure out which part of the coast would be most likely to hand documents over to the Germans. They thought through every detail, every possible way the plan could go wrong. The first problem was finding a body. They could not just use any corpse. It had to be someone who had died recently. It had to look like a drowning victim. And it had to be someone whose family would not ask questions. Montagu reached out to Sir Bernard Spilsbury, one of Britain's most famous pathologists. Spilsbury had worked on hundreds of murder cases and knew more about dead bodies than almost anyone alive. He agreed to help. Through quiet channels, they found a suitable candidate. The body was that of Glyndwr Michael, a homeless man who had died in London after eating rat poison laced with phosphorus. He was 34 years old. He had no close family. No one would come looking for him. His death was sad, but it also made him perfect for the mission. Montagu and Cholmondeley got permission from the coroner to use the body for military purposes, though they never told anyone outside the operation exactly what those purposes were. Now they had their corpse. Next, they had to turn him into someone else. They created a fictional identity. Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. They gave him a birth date, a rank, and a service record. They built an entire life around this fake person. They wanted the Germans to believe that Major Martin was a real officer carrying real documents, but creating a believable identity meant adding personal details, the kind of details that make a person seem real. So Montagu and his team went further than anyone expected. They gave Major Martin a personality. They put love letters in his pocket, written by a fictional fiancée named Pam. The letters were romantic, sweet, and entirely fake, written by a secretary in the intelligence office. They included a photograph of Pam, actually a photo of an MI5 clerk, who had no idea her picture was being used. They put ticket stubs in his wallet from a London theatre. They added receipts, a bill from a jeweler for an engagement ring, an overdraft notice from a bank. They even included a stern letter from Martin's father, scolding him for his financial irresponsibility. Every detail was designed to make Major Martin feel like a real person, someone with a life, someone with problems, someone with a future that had been tragically cut short. Then came the documents. The whole operation hinged on the fake invasion plans. These documents had to look legitimate. They had to seem important enough that the Germans would take them seriously, but not so obvious that they would suspect a trick. Montagu decided to use letters between senior British officers. One letter was from Lieutenant General Archibald Nye, the Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, addressed to General Harold Alexander, who commanded British forces in North Africa. The letter discussed upcoming operations and mentioned that the Allies were planning an invasion of Greece with a smaller diversion toward Sardinia. It mentioned Sicily only in passing as a cover story to distract the Germans. There was a second letter from Lord Louis Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations, to Admiral Andrew Cunningham, Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet. This letter was more personal and introduced Major Martin as an officer who was an expert in landing craft. It gave Martin a reason to be traveling with these documents. Both letters were carefully worded. They were written in the casual, confident tone of senior officers who had no reason to suspect anyone would ever read them except the intended recipients. They included inside jokes, references to mutual friends, and offhand comments about the weather. They felt real because they were written to feel real. The documents were placed in a briefcase which was chained to Major Martin's wrist, just as a courier carrying sensitive material would do. Now they had a body, an identity, and fake documents. The next step was getting the body into the water. The British submarine HMS Seraph was chosen for the mission. The crew was told very little. They were ordered to carry a large canister labeled as a secret meteorological device and release it off the coast of Spain. Only the captain, Lieutenant Norman Jewell, knew what was really inside. On April 19, 1943, the body of Glyndwr Michael, now dressed as Major William Martin, was placed inside a steel canister packed with dry ice to preserve it. The canister was loaded onto the submarine at Holy Loch in Scotland. The Seraph set off toward the southern coast of Spain. The location was carefully chosen. Huelva, a town on the Andalusian coast, was known to have both Spanish officials and German agents. Spain was officially neutral in the war, but in reality many Spanish officials were sympathetic to the Nazis. The British were counting on this. They wanted the Spanish authorities to find the body, examine the documents, and pass them along to the Germans. On April 30th, just before dawn, the Seraph surfaced off the coast of Huelva. The crew brought the canister onto the deck and opened it. Inside was the body of Major Martin, dressed in his Royal Marines uniform, his briefcase chained to his wrist. The officers said a brief prayer. Then they slid the body into the cold, dark water. The corpse floated away toward the Spanish coast. Now all they could do was wait. A few hours later, a Spanish fisherman spotted the body floating near the shore. He pulled it from the water and reported it to local authorities. The Spanish Navy recovered the body and took it to Huelva. A local doctor examined it and declared that Major Martin had drowned after a plane crash at sea. Everything looked legitimate. The briefcase was still chained to the body's wrist. Spanish officials opened it and found the letters. They photographed the documents and passed copies to the German intelligence network in Spain, just as the British had hoped. The documents made their way up the German chain of command. Within days, they reached Berlin. German intelligence analyzed them carefully. They checked the names, the signatures, the details. Everything matched. The letters seemed genuine. The Germans believed them. Hitler himself reviewed the intelligence. He became convinced that the Allies were planning to invade Greece, not Sicily. He ordered German forces to reinforce Greece and the surrounding areas. He sent troops, tanks, and aircraft away from Sicily. He moved an entire panzer division to Greece. He increased naval patrols in the Aegean Sea. He fell for the deception completely. Back in London, British intelligence was monitoring German communications through intercepted messages. They watched as the Germans repositioned their forces. They saw the troop movements. They knew the plan was working, but they had to be careful. If the operation was exposed, it would be a disaster, so they continued the deception even after the body was found. The British government sent a formal request to Spain, asking for the return of Major Martin's body and personal effects. They acted as though Martin had been a real officer who had died in a tragic accident. The Spanish returned the body, which was buried in Huelva with full military honors. The British even sent a wreath. To the Germans, this confirmed that Major Martin was real. Why would the British make such a fuss over a fake person? The Germans continued to believe the documents were genuine. They kept their forces away from Sicily, and when the Allies finally launched the real invasion of Sicily on July 10, 1943, they faced lighter resistance than expected. The beaches were not as heavily fortified as they could have been. The Germans had been caught off guard. The invasion succeeded. Sicily fell to the Allies within weeks. From there, the Allies pushed into mainland Italy. The tide of the war began to turn. Operation Mincemeat had worked. A dead homeless man from London, dressed as a Royal Marine, had fooled Hitler and changed the course of history. So how did a plan this strange actually succeed? What made the Germans believe something so elaborate? The answer comes down to psychology. British understood how intelligence agencies think. They knew that the Germans would be looking for any information about Allied invasion plans. They knew that German intelligence officers were under pressure to deliver results. And they knew that people tend to believe information they discover themselves more than information that is handed to them. By making the Germans find the documents rather than deliberately leaking them, the British removed suspicion. The Germans thought they had stumbled onto secret intelligence by luck. They did not question it as much as they would have if the information had come through a known double agent or intercepted communication. The personal details were crucial. The love letters, the receipts, the photo of Pam, the overdraft notice from the bank. All of these small touches made Major Martin feel like a real person. The Germans did not just analyze the documents, they analyzed the man. And when they looked at his personal effects, they saw someone authentic, someone who existed. There was also the matter of timing. By April 1943, the Germans were already expecting an Allied invasion somewhere in the Mediterranean. They were looking for clues about where it would happen. The documents from Major Martin gave them an answer. It was an answer they wanted to believe because it meant they could prepare. It gave them a sense of control. The British also understood that the Germans would check the details. That is why everything about Major Martin had to be perfect. The uniform had to be accurate. The documents had to use the right military language. The names had to be real officers. Even the briefcase had to be the type that a Royal Marine courier would actually use. And there was one more layer of deception. The letters mentioned Sicily, but only as a cover story. They said that the Allies were spreading rumors about invading Sicily to distract the Germans from the real target in Greece. This reverse psychology was brilliant. It made the Germans think that the Allies were trying to trick them into expecting Sicily, when in fact Sicily was the real target all along. The Germans fell for it because the deception was so detailed, so thorough, that it did not feel like a deception. It felt like the truth. There were a few close calls. At one point, a Spanish pathologist who examined the body raised questions about how long it had been in the water. The decomposition did not quite match what would be expected from a recent drowning. But German intelligence dismissed these concerns. They wanted to believe the documents, so they ignored the inconsistencies. After the war, British intelligence kept Operation Mincemeat secret for years. Even during the Nuremberg trials, when Allied officers were asked about deception operations, they said nothing about the dead body that had fooled Hitler. The truth finally came out in 1953, when Ewen Montagu published a book called The Man Who Never Was. It became a bestseller and was later turned into a film. Montagu revealed most of the details of the operation, though he changed some names and left out certain classified information. The book made Operation Mincemeat famous. It became one of the most celebrated intelligence operations in history. But for decades, one mystery remained. Who was the body? Montagu had refused to identify the real person behind Major Martin. He wanted to protect the man's privacy and the privacy of his family. It was not until 1996, more than 50 years after the operation, that researchers finally confirmed the identity. The body was Glyndwr Michael, the homeless man from London. There were debates about the ethics of using a dead person this way. Some people argued that Michael had not consented to being part of a military operation. Others pointed out that Michael had no family to object, and that his contribution, however unwitting, had saved thousands of lives by making the Sicily invasion less deadly. The impact of Operation Mincemeat went beyond just the Sicily invasion. It proved that large-scale deception operations could work. It showed that with enough planning and attention to detail, you could manipulate enemy intelligence. After the success of Mincemeat, the Allies used similar tactics for the D-Day invasion in 1944. They created fake armies, fake radio traffic, and fake invasion plans to convince the Germans that the landings would happen at Calais instead of Normandy. That operation, called Operation Fortitude, was even larger than Mincemeat, and it also succeeded. In many ways, Operation Mincemeat changed how wars are fought. It demonstrated that deception could be just as powerful as tanks and bombs. It showed that intelligence and creativity could outmaneuver brute force. And it all started with a dead man in a uniform floating in the ocean off the coast of Spain. The story of Operation Mincemeat is more than just a clever trick. It is a story about the strange, dark, and sometimes absurd nature of war. It is a story about how far people will go to gain an advantage, even if it means using the dead to deceive the living. But it is also a story about the importance of details. Every part of the plan mattered. The letters, the photographs, the receipts, the way the briefcase was chained to the wrist. If any of those details had been wrong, the Germans might have suspected a trap. They might have ignored the documents. Sicily might have been a bloodbath. Instead, because a small group of British intelligence officers took the time to create a perfect illusion, thousands of soldiers lived who might have died. The invasion succeeded. The war turned, and eventually the Allies won. Glyndwr Michael never knew that his body would be used this way. He died alone, forgotten, probably never imagining that his death would have any meaning. But in the end, his contribution was enormous. He became, in a strange and tragic way, one of the unsung heroes of World War II. There is a grave in Huelva, Spain, where Major William Martin is buried. For years, the headstone said only his fake name. Later, after the truth came out, a new inscription was added. It reads, Glyndwr Michael served as Major William Martin, R.M. Even in death, he served. The British officers who planned Operation Mincemeat were never famous. Most of them returned to normal life after the war. Ewen Montagu went back to practicing law. Charles Cholmondeley continued working in intelligence but never spoke publicly about his role. The crew of HMS Seraph went on to other missions, never fully understanding the importance of the strange package they had dumped into the ocean that night. But their work mattered. It saved lives. It changed history. And it proved that sometimes the most effective weapon is not a gun or a bomb. It is a story, a carefully crafted lie that the enemy wants to believe. Operation Mincemeat is still studied today in military academies and intelligence schools around the world. It is taught as a master class in deception. Students learn how to build a believable cover story, how to think like the enemy, how to exploit the human tendency to see what we expect to see. And it raises questions that are still relevant today. In a world of misinformation, deepfakes, and digital deception, how do we know what is real? How do we separate truth from lies? How do we avoid being fooled by a well-crafted story? The Germans in 1943 had every reason to be suspicious. They had intelligence officers, analysts, and experts. They had access to some of the best military minds in the world. And yet they were fooled by a dead man with a briefcase. They were fooled because they wanted to believe, because the story fit their expectations, because the details were convincing. We like to think we would not fall for something like that. We like to think we are smarter, more skeptical, harder to deceive. But history suggests otherwise. People are fooled all the time, even when the truth is staring them in the face. Operation Mincemeat worked because it understood something fundamental about human nature. We trust what we find more than what we are told. We believe what makes sense to us, and we see what we expect to see. That is why Major Martin seemed so real. He fit the pattern. He matched expectations. He was exactly what the Germans were looking for, so they found him. And in doing so, they lost Sicily, they lost Italy, and eventually they lost the war. The story of Operation Mincemeat reminds us that war is not just about who has the most soldiers or the biggest guns. It is also about who can think more creatively, who can outmaneuver the enemy not just on the battlefield, but in their minds. The British did not win because they were stronger. They won because they were smarter, because they understood that sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy is to make them defeat themselves. And they did it with a dead man, a briefcase, and a collection of fake love letters. The operation was never supposed to become public. It was meant to stay secret forever, buried along with Major Martin in that small cemetery in Spain. But the story was too good to stay hidden. It was too strange, too bold, too unbelievable to remain classified. And maybe that is fitting, because the whole point of Operation Mincemeat was to create a story so believable that even Hitler fell for it. So when the true story finally came out, people could barely believe that either. It sounded like fiction. It sounded like a movie plot, but it was real. Every part of it was real. The body, the letters, the briefcase, the submarine, the Spanish fishermen, the German intelligence officers analyzing the documents, Hitler moving his troops, the Allied invasion succeeding. All of it happened. All of it because someone had a crazy idea and a dead body. War is full of these moments. Moments where something impossible becomes possible, where desperation leads to creativity, where the strangest plans turn out to be the ones that work. Operation Mincemeat is one of those moments. It is a reminder that history is not just made by kings and generals. It is also made by intelligence officers sitting in small rooms, thinking up wild ideas, by pathologists who agree to help with strange requests, by submarine crews who follow orders without asking questions, by homeless men who die alone, never knowing that their death will one day matter. It is made by all of us in ways we cannot predict, and sometimes it is made by the dead who continue to serve even after they are gone. If you want more true stories from history that sound too strange to be real, check out the next video.